Do after you've turned in your midterm, when you've, the first thing that you want to do is determine what the appearance spaces are for all of your door components. So if you have a little knot that you're trying to hide, you want to make sure you have it on the back of the door. Or if you have one edge that's a little uglier than the other and you want to have the pretty edge facing out, you want to make sure that all of those considerations are taken into account when you go to position the pieces. I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to make that kind of a thoughtful selection here because I just squared up some scrap this morning. But one of the things that I want to show you is that unless you are lucky, and I tried to do this wrong on purpose so that you can see it, these two rails aren't exactly the correct length. And if your rails aren't exactly the correct length, you will end up with gaps. So the two ways that you can end up with gaps are to have pieces that are not square or to have rails that are not exactly the same length. So when it comes time to cut your rails, I strongly suggest that we set up a stop block so that we can reference the part against the stop block attached to the rip fence. So if this were the rip fence to the table saw, I could affix a stop block here so that when I go to actually cut this piece to length, I can abut the piece against the stop block so that they're all the exact same distance from the stop block to the saw blade. But before I engage this end with the saw blade, it's clear of the stop block. So I don't have to worry about the piece becoming bound between the fence and the block and causing a kickback or an injury. Make sense? So this is one of those situations where when you're cutting your rails to length, in addition to verifying that the tool is set up perfectly for 90 degrees, I don't recommend that you try and cut each piece to a pencil line. It's just too difficult to get them to be exactly the same length. So instead, if you set up a stop block, that'll enable you to make sure that both pieces are perfectly the same length. I recommend that you take your pieces after they've been cut and feel the ends until one end feels perfectly smooth, so you have difficulty even feeling. And remember, your fingertips have about 10 times the acuity of your eyes. So trust your fingertips. When I set this up so that it feels perfectly flush on one side, I want to hold the pieces together so that they cannot move and feel the other side. And if I feel any difference, I need to resolve that before I try and assemble my door. Because that little difference in length of the rails can cause gaps when you try and that I really care what these door pieces look like. It's just a bunch of scrap poplar that I milled up before class started. And so I've thoughtfully composed my door and I know exactly which one I want. Then I want to do a marking so that they go together the same way every single time. So I'm going to mark this one A, B, B, C, C, D, D. Now I can make sure that they go together the same way each and every time. The next thing that I need to do is remember that the door components are too big, and I'm probably going to end up taking off between an 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch off of the top and off of the bottom of the door so that it fits the carcass perfectly. When I go to assemble the door in the carcass, I'm looking for two things. I'm looking to make sure that I have a gap between the top of the door and the carcass that's even and consistent and as thin as possible, like the thickness of a playing card. But I'm also looking, when I'm done, to have the two rails look like they're the same width. Same thing when I go to fit the door to the carcass, after it's all glued up, I'm going to cut the top and bottom so that it fits in and the sides will overhang. And then I'm going to have to decide which side I'm going to hinge and which side is going to be the latch side. And I'm going to position the door on the carcass so that the overhang, the extent to which the stiles overhang the carcass on each side is roughly equal. And then on only the hinge side, I'm going to take my pencil and get it as sharp as I can get it, and I'm going to put my pencil against the side of the carcass, and I'm going to scribe the back of the door so that I can take the door and I can cut those stiles so that when I position my door on my carcass, it feels absolutely flush and smooth where the side of the door meets the carcass of the clock. Does this make sense to you guys? Okay. And so there are always two objectives to take into account with these doors. So the second objective in addition to having the sides of the clock feel absolutely flush with the stiles, is that when you look at it, the stiles appear to be the exact same width. Okay? Most people aren't going to be able to tell if there's a difference in width between two stiles that's less than a 1/16 of an inch. You guys can, because you're critical. You've learned how to look at these things through a critical eye of a woodworker. But most of the people that are going to walk through the Del Mar Fair, if your stiles are a different width by a 32nd of an inch, nobody will ever see it. You may know, but nobody else will ever see it, okay? I might notice.
Yeah, you
Well,
I won't
I
notice.
have a coil here of these dowels, and I want to show you. Let's look at the back first. So this is the front of this rail. If I flip it over this way, this is the section where I'm going to be milling the rabbets that the glass retainer is going to go in, right? And so I'm going to be taking off a 1/2 inch. I know that's not exactly 1/2 inch, but I'm going to be taking off a 1/2 inch in rabbets. And those rabbets are going to comprise 2 separate depths. And so I'm going to end up removing material 1/8 of an inch deep for the glass retainer and 1/8 of an inch deep for the glass, unless you have your glass and you know the thickness. 1/8 of an inch is kind of a filler dimension. I strongly recommend that you get your glass in hand before you mill the rabbets, because if your glass is too thick or too thin, that could be problematic. Now I know where those rabbets are going to be. I know that I don't want to expose those rabbets, so I need to locate my dowels so that they're not going to accidentally become exposed, okay? And then by the same token, if I have selected some decorative profile that I'm going to mill on the outside of the door, I don't want to expose the dowels when I mill those either, so I have to position them so that I'm not going to inadvertently expose the dowels when I'm milling either the rabbits or whatever decorative profile I've selected for the door. Now, if you look at the clocks themselves over here, this is a goofy kind of a setup, because in the parlance of cabinet doors and things, usually the easiest ways to position your dowels is to actually have, oh gosh, I just took all my door pieces and I mixed them all up. No, I'm not sure exactly. Oh, yeah, that's right, I have letters. Thank goodness I have letters, right? So now, even if I put them behind my back and somebody spins me around and puts a blindfold on me, when I take the blindfold off, I can still see A, B, B, C, C, D, D. If you haven't done that, especially when you're laying out where you're going to be drilling the holes for your dowels, you could end up with a door that might not be exactly what you expect. So if you haven't done this before, I like to position the dowel on the door and visualize the width of the dowel. You typically want to have cheeks, that is to say, when I bore a hole in this that's going to be 3/8 of an inch in diameter here, this material that's left over between the dowel and the edge of the door is what I'm going to call cheek material. Okay, it's kind of like on a person. I have a cheek cut, I have a shoulder cut, like for mortise and tenons. And I don't want this cheek material to be too thin, because that could lead to problems. And that's where we get into the rule of thumb, 3/8 inch dowels for 3/4 inch material. If I put a 1/4 inch dowel centered on 3/4 inch material, if the joints weren't stressed, it might be strong enough. But because the mass of the door is substantially bigger than the mass of the dowels, it would be possible under some construction scenarios for you to snap the dowels in half. What happens if you go to a dowel that's too big? What happens if you're trying to join together 1/2 inch material and you put in 3/8 inch dowels? The cheek material would end up being so thin, but that now that there is a risk that if you stress the components, the stiles and rails could fracture and you'd end up exposing the dowels. Make sense? So in addition to making sure that when we center the dowels in the door here, we end up with enough cheek material so that we have a strong door assembly, we also need to make sure that when we position the dowels here, we don't accidentally expose the dowels when we're cutting decorative profiles or rabbets in the doors. And since we know that the clock components, the door components, should be at least 1/8 of an inch too tall, I don't want to position these things so that they're too close. When I adjust it for fit, I had my dowel too close to the edge of the door. Now I cut the door to fit the carcass, I've exposed the dowel. Oh no. It's not the end of the world. You'd only see it if you open the door and look at the underside of the door maybe. But we would all know, and that would be a little bit disappointing, okay? So I'm gonna try and suggest to you that holding a dowel on top of the work is a great way to visualize how much space it's gonna take up, and to ensure that if I try to put it right here, I might end up with cheek material here that's so thin that it could cause a problem with fracturing or inadvertent exposure. So I typically want to have it held back just enough so that after I've done any decorative profiles on the front of the door, the dowels won't be inadvertently exposed. But I also want to make sure that I have enough material between the edge of the wood that I'm drilling into and the dowel that it's not going to produce a weak spot. Make sense? So the easiest way to do this is just to take a nice sharp pencil, hold the pieces in the exact position that you want them to be in, and just draw a line. And I'm just going to say I'm going to just draw a line across. Now, this line I drew kind of thick and fat so that you would be able to see it. But for your dowel joints, you want to make one nice, crisp, clean, thin pencil line. And the reason is because the thicker the line is, the more inexact its location is going to be when we go to horizontal boring machine. When we go to the horizontal boring machine, we're going to try and drill a hole based on your line. And if your line is thick and flat, and well, which part of this line do you want me to line up that drill bit with, right? So if I make my line and I want it to be really precise, I guess if I wanted to get fussy, I could take my square and I could put it across, and I could draw a line that's exactly in the right place and make one crisp, clean line, and that's easier to line up. So don't be afraid to take that step. It won't hurt you, but most of the time, also keep in mind that I don't want these in line with one another. So if this one's this far away, I probably want to move this one up just a little bit so it doesn't spin around when I get it glued up. But if I just have a nice sharp pencil and I have the lines so that they're kind of, the ends that they kind of feel flush, I can just draw a nice pencil line. It doesn't have to be very long. And that tells me where I want to drill my holes. So I'm going to put one here, and I have this one deliberately off center. Now, I don't know if those holes are going to be in the right locations or not.
Would you recommend like a quarter of an eighth an inch or a quarter of an inch to offset?
Yeah, sure. An eighth to a quarter is a really good rule of thumb. It's enough to prevent it from spinning. I'll let you know in advance that sometimes I drill these holes in the wrong place just on purpose so that you can see what happens when you drill the holes in the wrong place. So don't be surprised at that. Okay. So let's go over to the horizontal boring machine.